What I'm going to do is just really sort of briefly outline some of the contours of this really multifaceted crisis that our world finds itself in. And I obviously work for an organisation that's concerned with poverty and the lives of the poorest people around the world. But in the last few years, you may have noticed that we've got quite angry about the extent of inequality at Oxfam. And back in 2014, we first released some figures in time for Davos. You know, we're very tactical with where we release these sorts of things. And we calculated the number of billionaires whose amount of wealth added up to the same amount of wealth held by the poorest half of the world's population. And so when we first released these statistics for Davos a few years ago, it was 85. 85 billionaires had as much wealth as the poorest half of the population. And that figure went viral. It was just extraordinary. Everyone was talking about it. And then we recalculated it again for the next year, and it had come down to 80. And we did it again last year, and it came down to 62. And we were thinking, my goodness, it's not going to get much worse than this, is it? But what happened is that some of the data sets that we draw on from Credit Suisse, they had improved data, particularly for India and China. And that actually showed us that folks were poorer than we had thought they were. And so when we tallied up, using the Forbes list, the number of billionaires that it took to have as much wealth as the poorest half of the world's population, it was just 8 men, and which was extraordinary. So that was our figure that we released back in January, and there's a report online that you can see the calculations behind that. And happy to chat in questions some of the pushback that we've had around the methodology and also what it is we're saying, because our opponents have sort of shifted their attack on that work a little bit over the years, and it's quite an interesting journey. So ask me later on if you want to talk about that. But in a way, what we were saying with these reports, it's not those individuals' fault, but they are very much the symptom of an economic system that enables wealth to be sucked up to the very top. This is very much a zero-sum game. We see that these individuals are working often in companies that are based on rentier activities, industries that are prone to corruption and cronyism. We did some analysis of there's about 1,800 billionaires in the world, and my colleagues in Oxfam America looked at how those folks have derived their wealth and discovered that over half of them have made their money through industries that are rentier activities or prone to corruption and cronyism. And so it really is a systemic, it's nature of the economic model. And I used to talk about the broken economic system, but I don't anymore, because in a way, the system is doing just what it's designed to do. We're talking a lot about political capture, the way that the rules of the game are set by those, and I'll talk about this later on, by those who have the most resources already. So we see a very tight confluence between power and wealth. And I mean, this stuff from Wilkinson and Pickett will probably be familiar to you, the extent to which, it really is about why is Oxfam concerned with inequality, because it's holding back the progress on addressing poverty. We know from the works of, say, the Overseas Development Institute, also the World Bank and the IMF themselves, saying that we will not reach the development goal, the Sustainable Development Goal of eradicating extreme poverty by 2030 unless we reverse extreme levels of inequality. But you'll see from Wilkinson and Pickett, it's not just about poverty either. It's about a whole lot of other social problems that arise from the extent of inequality generated by this system that we've got. And a couple of years ago, I did some work where we took this idea of the donut, which I'm going to assume that you all know about. That was created. Our notion of the donut came from Kate Rayworth when she was working in the team that I'm now in back in 2012. So I won't talk about the concept. I'm assuming familiarity here. But what we did is we said, okay, how do we downscale that metaphor to the UK? How do we understand the extent to which the UK is lifting folks above a social foundation and breaching an environmental ceiling? And so we tried to translate some of the components of that donut and then map how the UK was performing against those. And again, in the interest of time, I won't talk you through them, but other than and it's all on, there's a huge report online that you can go and have a look at. Other than the point is that you can see that across various dimensions of a social foundation, the UK is still failing on every single count. So you can see here, for example, governance, how far people are from the social foundation. Food, this is one example, about 9% of people go to bed hungry in the UK. So you get a sense, the point being is that the UK, despite being 6th or 7th richest country in the world, is still failing to lift all its citizens above a social foundation. And then we did it for the UK for the environmental ceiling, and it was a tricky process to navigate. How do we translate these big global planetary boundaries to an environmental ceiling that applied for the UK? And I'm sure, I don't think we've cracked it, but we've tried to be as open as we can on our report, so you can see the choices that we made and the proxies that we went into. But again, without going into detail, you can see it's a pretty grim story on the environmental front as well, that we are breaching the environmental ceiling across a whole lot of dimensions of the environmental story. I mean, particularly here, climate change, this little world shooting out. I think we breach, and this isn't historic, just Fair Share's assessment of climate change by about 490%, land use change by 250%. And of course, the good news story up there in terms of ozone, where just always nice to be reminded that policy does matter. And so, looking globally again, we did some analysis in time for the Paris COP when we're looking at, who is it? Who is it in this big global system that is putting most pressure on the planet? And we calculated total lifestyle consumption emissions, so that includes what is made elsewhere but imported for folks to consume. And this looks at the world's population by income decile, and this ironic champagne glass figure that it yields. And you can see that it's almost 50% of CO2 emissions by lifestyle and consumption emitted by the richest 10% of people around the world. And this is why, isn't it? These sort of big flows. And so this is the sort of conversation you need to have with people when they start making claims of decoupling. There are huge resources moving around the world, and it is again the richest, wherever they live, who are putting most pressure on the planet. And then you bring those sort of stories together of rising levels of inequality, rising levels of social harm, often connected to inequality, hitting up against planetary boundaries in all its dimensions. And then we see the work from folks at Social Progress indicating, most folks know their work, the Social Progress Index. So what they've done is they've got 3 different dimensions of what they called social progress and about 52 indicators underneath that. And they've mapped social progress according to these 3 dimensions across the y-axis and GDP per capita along the x. And what's really key is you see, yes, at the very beginning stages of sort of starting to meet basic needs, sort of foundations of well-being, GDP per capita really matters. But you see at fairly low levels of GDP per capita, the returns start to diminish. You've got this, economics 101, this notion of diminishing marginal returns, to the point that, for example, to pick one out, you have Costa Rica up here, fairly similar levels of social progress to South Korea here, but a difference in GDP per capita of about £20,000. But there's all sorts of other really interesting comparisons to make. The point is diminishing marginal returns, that this perpetual economic growth is not delivering the benefits in terms of social progress that we'd expect from it. And so part of that is sort of the way we've geared up our system around consumption. I took these pictures. They're an ad at an airport I noticed a few years ago. And I just think, isn't this the most toxic way in which to understand our cousins and friends around the world, purely as customers and potential customers? It's just extraordinary. I'm based in Glasgow, where Glasgow used to be very proud being the 2nd biggest city of the British Empire. And now the way it sells itself as Britain's 2nd biggest shopping destination. And you can imagine the extraordinary disruption of that shift from a very proud industrial community to one where it's all about being a consumer and wearing the right things. And again, part of that, and this is partly what I was talking about before with political capture, is just how that system is geared up in a way that the success goes to the successful. The rich are able to rig the rules of the game, and so that they benefit again and again. And we see that particularly with a lot of the structure of businesses that are designed in a way to siphon wealth away from, say, smallholder farmers or employers in a way that it goes up to shareholders. It's very extractive economic model. And again, we see that just rewards folks who have already got money. And this is what Piketty was talking about when he says, you know, when the returns in capital, R is greater than G. And now we've got actually businesses that are set up to increase those returns on capital. And then we're surprised, well, we've got a situation where 8 men have as much wealth as the rest of half of the population because the rules are established in a way that creates that. And this to me is the irony, is that these 8 men, yeah, almost 7 there, would have been great if there was 8, essentially at the same time as really standing on the shoulders of, you know, if you look at the work, say, of Mariana Mazzucato, standing on the shoulders of a lot of collective investment. Particularly, for example, one of the richest guys is the owner of Amazon, but they can't operate without roads, without a postal service, etc. You know, Microsoft can't operate without educated citizens. All of that requires public collective investment. So we have this going on, and then at the same time we have this individualization of welfare. We have people being told they're not employable enough, they're not flexible enough, they must toughen up, they must be more resilient. So, and just an extraordinary, sort of to me, paradox. And part of that system comes back to how we purpose the nature of our economic model, the way it's geared up to increase gross domestic product. And despite all the perverse incentives that are bound up by GDP, and I won't, can you read it at the back with the funny lighting? Yeah, I won't read it out, but it just, this notion of the GDP hero by Mark Kanowski, who's a Canadian economist, to me just sums up so painfully, but so beautifully, why GDP is not the sort of indicator of progress, not the measure of success that we should be using for our national economies. And then at the micro level, at firm level, I mean, you can guess which country this came from. But in a way, profit is the sort of firm, short-term profit to shareholders is sort of the firm level equivalent of GDP. It effectively incentivizes a whole lot of corner cutting, externalizing a whole lot of impacts to it, whatever firms can get away with it. The zero-sum game at the negotiating table between the interests of shareholders and the interests of workers or the interests of local communities or the interests of suppliers. And my colleagues in the private sector are seeing that again and again and again, and they get incredibly frustrated with all these quite often quite wonderful and I'd say quite sincere mission statements and vision statements and voluntary codes of conduct for companies. And I would say often they're drafted with sort of genuine intent to do business better. But often when they hit that negotiating table, when the firm is having to take money and siphon it up to shareholders, we get sort of comments like this. To the point that even Jack Welch, who reportedly coined the term shareholder value, is now saying it's the dumbest idea in the world. And we'd certainly concur with that. And this, of course, plays out at a micro level for individuals, where we've got an economy built around consumerism and individualization. And yet we know that shame and avoidance of shame is one of the most profound emotions that people can feel. And we see this with communities I used to work with when I was part of Oxfam's Scotland team. Communities in some of the poorest neighbourhoods in Scotland, where mothers particularly would consciously skimp on the food that they provide their kids in order to be able to make sure that when their kids walked outside and went to school, they weren't looking visibly poor, that they had the right phone, the right trainers, the right clothes. Now, these mums aren't stupid. They know they need to nourish their kids, but they had this separation between visible and invisible consumption. And that is society that pushes those sorts of pressures onto mothers to feel that the shame and stigma of being poor in the UK today is worse than not nourishing them through the right food. And then that sort of spurs these sort of efforts to try and console ourselves. I mean, I haven't talked about the precarious nature of the labour market. Perhaps we could do that in questions. But we know that people are feeling alienated and stressed, and that there's big economic decisions that are happening without them able to control them. And so Sergei Latouche talks, I think, a really, really powerful term of consolation goods, how we're spending so much money basically to console ourselves because of the pretty stressful, precarious, insecure lives. And there's this whole industry that have spun up about it. I didn't talk about uneconomic growth. The longer version of this talk talks quite a bit about uneconomic growth that Herman Daly talks about. Those of you who are ecological economists will be very familiar with the term defensive expenditures. But if you take that notion over to social policy, as a concept of failure demand, where we know that so much of what local authorities particularly, but other levels of the state expend is because of our unequal system. So it's essentially the macro version of consolation goods, say a lot of remedial education, a lot of accident and emergency, a lot of the criminal justice system. We are spending because we're hurting communities and families and individuals on our way to try and increase GDP. And this stuff really is a matter of life and death. This is something that my friend Jerry McCartney, who works at the NHS in Scotland, has done. And you're probably familiar with Michael Marmot's version for London. But this is the Glasgow train map. And you can see if you live out here in sort of the West End where the university is, and it's really a nice part of town, men can expect to live for about 76 years. But for every train stop that you travel east, and you just get the other side of the city. I was saying to a friend the other day, if I was feeling really energetic, I could probably run that in about an hour, and I'm pretty slow. So it's not a very far distance. But by the time you get to Bridgeton, male life expectancy is down below 62 years. So a fall in life expectancy of 2 years for every train stop. And if you keep going east, it plummets even more. And so this angst that we're putting on people is extraordinarily a matter of life and death. And yet, this seems to be the prescription for change. We see people told to be more positive, to change their thinking, to be more resilient, just be happy, focus on their own thinking rather than the sort of circumstances around them. So if we're going to think about solutions, and I've got 5 minutes left, this is again the sort of be resilient version or win the race version of be positive. For those at the back of you, it's a cartoon of a city, and the little speech bubble says, I'm going mad, I need some space, some fresh air and some sky. And the reaction is, don't worry, darling, one day we'll get out of this madness, we'll be free, we'll go and live on the 92nd story. And why I like that is because it's basically saying, this is the solutions that we're being offered by mainstream economics, by conventional policy making, is just get to the top of the pile. Don't worry about changing the system at all. Just win that race. Yeah, get to the top where maybe circumstances are okay. Buy your way out of being impacted by climate change, etc. But what we really need to do is have a conversation about getting inside this donut space. And we're starting to call this the human economy in Oxfam. I'm interested in your feedback on that term. But that basically, the human economy is one that works for people and planet. Nothing more complicated by that. But part of that is how we count what matters, how we measure what matters. And Kate mentioned the Humankind Index that we did in Scotland a few years ago. Very, very participatory, very much from grassroots up, reaching out to some of the most deprived communities in Scotland and saying to them, what do you need to live well in your community? Really happy to talk about that in Q&A. But it's also about a massive redistribution of resources. We know that poverty is an issue of wealth. It's about how so many people getting way more than their fair share. And so even, this is work done by folks at the ODI, even within countries, this is even putting aside global imbalances, we could eradicate a lot of poverty just by redistributing what's already there. It's also about, and Maja I think was going to talk a lot more about some of the solutions, but sort of really making the most of sunk assets. So circular economy, collaborative economy. This is up at Leeds, the Lilac community up there. These 4 washing machines serve 25 families. And just a really simple example of making the most of what we've already extracted out of the ground rather than 25 families having 1 washing machine each. Just a sweet little example. Another one is also how we redistribute work. And you'll be aware of these sort of conversations around automation. Tanya Murray-Lee says that there are about 1 billion people across the world who are surplus to the interests of the global capitalistic production system. And so if we're going to get our handle on making sure that these folks have purpose, we're going to have to start sharing the available work, however that work is defined, and we can again have a conversation about gender. This is, the core economy. This is a little place just on the east coast of Scotland called Dunbar, and they've taken over their bakery. What's key is these words here: the proprietor is the community. And I think it's another really lovely example about the sort of business models we need to create, those that redistribute wealth, that ensure that the economic levers are owned by the communities or by workers. I mean, Oxfam's been working with producer cooperatives and employee cooperatives for decades, and it's a really great way in which you can start to turn the tables on the imbalances of power in that economic system by basically collective action, folks working together and owning the means of production. And just to finish, this is essentially a cartoon version of the notion of the Overton window, that part of our job is to start to keep these issues on the table and tell folk, because you can see that actually the Beyond GDP movement, I think, is a good example of something that even just a few years ago, an alternative to GDP was seen as unimaginable and ridiculous. But it's, you know, I think the case is being made fairly strongly that GDP is not working. We saw last May, The Economist had a big leader on the flaws of GDP. We've got the World Economic Forum has got a big site on its website around how we need to go beyond GDP. So things start to move. And I think this is just, to me, a bit of a motivational cartoon to remind us that this sort of conversation does take time. Maja's going to tell us how to do it, though. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. That was actually perfect, just for me to weigh in now. Two words on why a possibilist. I think it comes because I've been trained with Gramscian thinking, so political economy with a strong notion of hegemony. And the question that he's been kind of tackling when coming up with his concept of hegemony was, how can we explain that so many people go with a system, when he was talking about democracy under capitalism, that it's absolutely unequal, but still they accept it, or at least they go along with it. How can that be? How can we find an explanation for that? And one of the things that he brought forward that I feel is a lot missing in many of the structural accounts of economic change and development, even the critical ones, is the people. The people's affirmation, or at least acceptance, or at least feeling of there is no better way. And he's brought forward this idea of hegemony as the narrative, both the common sense, explanations about how the world works, the canonized knowledge, what is being taught in our institutions, but also, of course, the narratives and the behavior and the routines of especially those in a society that have made it, quote unquote, so rather well off. And the kind of stories that are being told, which create legitimacy, create justification, but also create answers for those that might start feeling a bit cognitive dissonance by the total disequilibria. And for me, that was one of the key insights with which I was going into finding out, why do we as societies not go towards bringing about sustainable prosperity when all the people I talk to think that's a great idea? And this is why I've gone back and forth between campaigning and academia. So for me, the thinking was always a tool for doing practice differently. And that's been also the intention with which I'm now working as a transformation scholar, to understand big picture change, because next to Gramsci, I found Karl Polanyi a very inspiring and very telling person to read when you want to understand how the economic system came around that we have. And he's talking about the great transformation having started with the emergence and then embedding of the neoclassical thought, or then starting off with classical thinkers, and the paradigm that is still built into our societies today, from our heads and rationales with which we're acting, into our institutions, incentives, punishments, laws, or the ones that we might want to climb up the ladder for changing. And this is how I've been going about writing the book, because transformation scholars are saying, oh, we can only know ex post if a transformation really has happened. We don't know right now if it's going to be a transformation or a relapse or a calibration of the old system, but ex post we'll be able to see a transformation has taken place. And I thought, well, that's great, but we want to also act towards transformation intentionally if we feel that we want to change it. So how can we understand this? Because a lot of transformation talks about cascading innovations or diffusion of ideas and those elements. And I thought, but how does diffusion take place? How are things cascading? And it brought me back to the people. And this is, of course, how are people motivated? How do people instill change, make sense of where they're going? Where's the purpose coming from with which they're engaging in societies? There I went back to Gramsci. And then if the transformations are supposed to foster sustainable developments, because we, of course, can have very different types of transformations. So knowing about how to maybe push towards system change does not necessarily bring us towards a sustainable outcome. And I think when we looked at least the last 40 years, we saw a lot of very smartly done transformational change by the ones that are now amongst the top 10 in the world population in terms of possessions and power. So what is a high leverage point or key leverage points if we want to unlock some of those unsustainable path dependencies from our heads to our institutions and to our infrastructure? And this is where it gets a bit theoretical, but I always find it is one of the elements that are so helpful integrating in a conversation when you start talking about what are good solutions and how do you consider change, etc., to a little bit disclose how you think the world works, so that you can actually understand whether you're talking from a similar idea about change or no. And this, for me, was the one that is, of course, very Gramsci-inspired to say, actually, when we think about what is the driver, this intentional change maker, that sense-making actors, they co-create productive processes. And to understand those processes as relationships. Relationships between people, humans and humans, relationships between people and nature, human-nature relationships, but also then human technology, human infrastructure. So everything that we've started building becomes part of the reality with which we're engaging, and then living within that reality, the social, ecological, technical systems that we have created is, of course, shaping our idea about how the world is, what works, what is possible, what is legitimate, what we can imagine as future developments. So this is why I find the term path dependencies is very, very helpful in understanding why we are creating history, but not necessarily under the circumstances of our liking. And then, not to forget, whoever is concerned about sustainability, to, of course, say, oh, all of those socio-ecological technical systems in their operations, of course, impact on the Earth system that is also embedding in the way that nature looks and availability, etc., how we make sense of the world, but it's also directly, of course, feeding all those productive processes with which we are living and depending on. But also to understand how this making of history, and this is Marx' abbreviated quote, is really done under the circumstances that we've inherited from the generations before us. So just thinking differently is not enough, but it is the equipment and the empowering moment of challenging some of those things that we might otherwise be presented as facts or unchangeable or just the way it has to be. So part of the hegemonic way of interpreting the world. And this ties back with transformation, because there's a lot of buzz, I don't know about over here, but I think generally there's a lot of buzz about transformation talk and how do we understand this. We need a great transformation in order to change towards sustainability, etc. And then there's loads of different definitions. And this one is the one that I prefer, because it does also emphasize that it is people that can drive transformation. So the transformation or transformability in social ecological systems is defined as the capacity to create untried beginnings from which to evolve a fundamentally new way of living when existing ecological, economic, and social conditions make the current system untenable. And I think Catherine has shown us more than enough evidence that this untenable stage is actually being reached right now. So what I find the interesting one is this untried beginnings. So how do we get in the imaginary space of doing something very different? And how do we ensure or support that those that are going there and thus deviating from the status quo get the support and become the trendsetters of the new normal? And this new normal, of course, starts with something that is the imaginary from which we're operating. And once again, I come to the mindsets. And Donella Meadows is another bridge between our work. And this is from her article, Leverage Points. And it does tie in well with the kind of ontology that I presented at the beginning to say, if we think about human-created systems, the moment that will tell us most about the dynamics with which they're operating is actually the mindset or the purpose that was built into that system. If I want to create a company that is delivering for the community at low cost, I will find a very different business model than if I create a company that is supposed to deliver on the shareholder value in short term at a maximum degree. So from this purpose come then the rules and incentives, the feedback and adjustments with which I'm structuring my whole business, with which I think this way of collaborating, this way of incentivizing, this way of paying people is going to make sure they stay with that purpose and with that mission. Very different, depending on the purpose that is inbuilt into those structures. And this is why repurposing is not the same as extrapolating. And a lot of what we see now in the canonized knowledge with which we're operating, coming back to the hegemony of the thinking, is of course in the extrapolation. We are supposed to predict, to do prognosis, etc., about the trajectories of how future developments are coming to be, especially in economics. It's all about knowing the costs and the benefits, and when you talk about long term, you have to discount because people will be richer in the future, so you can't impose too many costs on the present because future generations will have to pay much less for the same amounts and the technology will be much greater. If the planet's still going to be around, it doesn't really matter in economics, so we'll just say, no, we're going to discount, we can't invest today because in the future it's going to be cheaper and people are going to be richer. So all that extrapolation or the measurements or the ideas with which we're building futures very, very often are within the same mindset that has created the problems that we're trying to tackle. And there, of course, the most prominent or most known quote is Einstein, that we can't solve the problems of today with the same mindset that created them. So we need to really start from imagined different futures so that we can build the institutional frameworks around a different purpose, a different mindset, or say, maybe a public health system was great, the purpose is actually intact, but what we've been doing through pressures from the outside, et cetera, is to totally pervert the incentives, rules, and structures which we are trying to pursue that purpose. So it can be either say, chug the purpose out, growth only is not really going to get us anywhere, or public health service was actually great, but we've lost the purpose through small incremental changes, through not being too reflective about what we're doing, too much adaptive change. So we want to go back to the purpose and reinvigorate it. And this is where I've tried to go into not only saying which elements in the economic paradigm that is so dominant today, so provides a lot of the legitimacy, etc., is unhelpful, but to see, can I get a bit deeper? Can I get a bit more into the paradigm, into the way of thinking that is kind of emerged in the 19th century, in the first Enlightenment? And how can we then also break out of only economics into wider thinking about what it is that we're doing here and how do we understand the world? And for me, it was very notable to say at that period of time, it was dividing things into pieces in order to understand them better, microscopes and everything, zoom in on the individual elements to understand them better, losing a bit about the relationships. And then the quantifying and monetizing was another one. Then we can measure and we can account, we can compare and rank things and decide. And tracking accumulation was the thing that we've built most into our indicators, into knowing are we on a good course, is tracking accumulation. But that means that it's not fit for sustainability purpose, because neither human needs can be seen with this, nor can we see nature if we only look at this. Now, I've only got a few examples here. When you think about dividing into pieces and look at forests, if we look at it as natural capital and think about it can be substituted as long as someone makes enough money to pay something else, a different technology, as long as we only count wood, we might use the same term, but are looking at totally different realities. So we have to get into digging deeper and unveiling what we mean when we use particular terms. Quantifying and monetizing. We really are into a market price dictatorship by now. So if we can up shareholder value, might as well poison the cafeteria. Why not? We're still on purpose, aren't we? Tracking accumulation. More growth through more efficient exploitation. I think this is coming up now with the whole Industry 4.0 and robotization, all that. Yeah, people are just really not so efficient. They're weighing too much. Kick them out. And once again, let's keep the shell but lower the quality so that the turnover gets upped when we are selling more and more goods in shorter periods of time. Comparing and ranking. This is from Tim Kasser's work. Cost-benefit thinking, happiness through consumption. Is this really going to get us somewhere? Is this really going to change the lever? Or are we just going to choose who we compare to in order for not having to change? Or being fearful that we might go down the ladder when we stop consuming as much? And this is why I feel changing the way we think, changing the way we argue, and changing the way we justify things is actually a fundamental high leverage point in how we can even enact bigger change. And this is a graph from, oh, and yet you got the German version and the first one. The other ones are English, I promise. From Transformation Science. They try to, it's my last graph, they try to understand a bit more, how does bigger change happen? And so they divide into micro level, meso level, and macro level. And the definition or the distinction here is not so much about size, it's also size, but also about changeability. So where can things change faster, and what time horizons are we looking at? And of course, the higher you get, the more entwined the systems are, the more the causal links that you will have to change when you're trying to change stuff. And so the idea is that the niche level is the one where fastest change can happen and more radical change can happen. Whereas the higher you get into science, into rules and laws and market structures, social practices, but also established technologies, the longer it takes to get out of those path dependencies. And then on the macro level, usually they put a lot of things together. I put ecosystems out. There's also paradigms and market structures, but I feel the paradigms deserve to be on top. Because there's this overarching explanation of why all this should be maintained, or why is this justifiable? Why do we keep this? All of that is being fed by the worldviews, vision, paradigms, narratives that we have established, the hegemonic ways of doing things. And it also means that we can add a mini me and you level, because we are carriers of this world view and paradigm. So we can challenge. We can sit in science. We can start a new niche thing. We can be individuals that are going to bring forward a different way of looking at things, that are going to challenge the factual ways of presenting why things have to be. And in doing so, we surely, over time, are also going to change the worldviews and paradigms, the established narrative about where the world is going and why a particular purpose to pursue in this society is a good or a bad one. And with this, I think we can open up. I'm sorry, but I've tried to present some of the ideas that I found in my own work to really be helpful, and it's always an additional ammunition I found when you have a theoretical grounding and founding of what you're doing. And I'm very happy to suss out the kind of similarities and traits in how this kind of thinking can inform the kind of work that you're doing. It's all summarized in there, with 4 case studies, actually, on transition towns, the commons, and the common good economy, and beyond GDP initiatives, where I was myself absolutely surprised and excited about the similarities when you think about the paradigm, where I criticized the one that is not working, and I just looked at what kind of paradigms do they put forward, and there were so many similarities that I thought, wow, this is starting a wave. This is not single individual utopianists. This is really a paradigm shift in the making, and that means that we're into the transformation at least, and have to fight for the new paradigm to come around. And it's open access, so you can download the whole thing. Thank you.